And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather shows this intense storm pulling in toward the western Aleutians, bringing a big area of gale and storm force winds with it, pushing eastward across the eastern Aleutian, or the central Aleutians. This stationary and slowly weakening front here keeps rain and snow going for the Alaska Peninsula. Light snow along the coastal areas of the Yukon Delta on up towards St. Lawrence Island. Clear and cold in the interior with gusty winds here, especially on the western side from Norton Sound northward to the northwest coast there. And low pressure forms south of Resurrection Bay, and that's going to increase the chances for snow across all of the North Gulf Coast, Copper River Basin, on up into the eastern Alaska Range, as well as south central Alaska. And for tomorrow, that low moves in and weakens into a trough, and that'll keep snow chances going here for Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula, as well as the Copper River Basin, Madawaska-Susitna Valley. Areas east and south of the Alaska Range have the best chance of seeing a significant snowfall. Otherwise, clear and cold. Central northern interior, more clouds down here to the southwest, a little bit milder. Not too bad over the Panhandle, mostly dry, if not completely dry, with some clearing. And this weakening front here keeps a slight chance of snow going along the coastal areas of the southwest coast. Better chance for Nunivak Island, and still some lingering rain or snow showers there for the Alaska Peninsula. This intense system slowly starting to weaken now, but still down to 940 millibars, so a lot of gale and storm force winds blowing around that center. Wind and rain pushing into the eastern Aleutians, and then on Monday, that low just kind of drifts north, staying back to the west there. Wave develops along the frontal boundary there, keeping it wet here over the eastern Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula. Area of snow mostly out over the northern Bering Sea here, but should spread into St. Lawrence Island. Keep a chance of snow along the Yukon Delta coast, Nunivak Island area. Mostly cloudy, areas of light snow here over the southwest interior into south central Alaska again, with the heaviest amounts along the southern coast of the Kenai Peninsula down to about Kodiak Island, and breezy with but dry conditions here. Copper River Basin now on up into the interior with lighter winds up toward the Brooks Range of the Arctic coast and staying dry, but a little bit more of a northeast wind there for the Panhandle. Coastal water forecasts, south coast, east winds 10 to 15 knots, east-southeast 10 to 15 for the central coast, and then south winds at 10 knots for the north coast. North winds at 10 knots with 2-foot seas for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and Stevens Passage, with winds east at 10 for Clarence Strait. Then those winds pick up a little bit on Monday on the south coast out of the east at 20 knots, and east winds 25 knots here for the central coast, and then back down to 10 to 15 knots from the east-northeast on the north coast. Small craft advisories there for Lynn Canal for north winds 25 knots, north at 20 for Stevens Passage, and southeast winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. And variable winds at 10 knots for Prince William Sound. Otherwise, the eastern North Gulf Coast looking at south to southwest winds at 20 knots. Light variable winds for the western North Gulf Coast, the Barren Islands, northeast at 20 for southern Cook Inlet, and Kamishak Bay with northeast at 15 for northern Cook Inlet. And then moving on to Monday, got 30-knot northeast winds in the forecast for southern Cook Inlet, lighter north of the Forelands, and east at 30 knots for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, east 25 for the western North Gulf Coast, east at 15 for Prince William Sound, and eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds at 20. Kodiak Island, variable winds at 10 knots tomorrow. Southeast 25 for the Alaska Peninsula, east 25 for Bristol Bay. And then looking at some gale warnings for Bristol Bay on Monday, east at 35 knots, the Alaska Peninsula, east-southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, and 30-knot winds out of the east for Kodiak Island. And here for the western Aleutians tomorrow, with the low center right through here, have the winds blowing around that anywhere from 35 to 50 knots. Good gales for Adak and Atka, south 35 to 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 35 to 45 knots. And then for Monday, western Aleutians there, looking at Still gale force winds 35 to 45 knots. South 30 to 35 for Adak and Atka, and for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Southwest coast tomorrow, looking at east, or forecast to see, you will see east winds at 30 knots here, all across the Bering Sea, east at 30 there from the Pribilofs up to St. Matthew Island, with the gale warnings now up for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island out of the east, 35 knots. And then for the day Monday, Norton Sound, east winds 35 knots, east at 30, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, good gales now for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, east at 40 knots, northeast 45 knots, St. Matthew Island, east at 30 knots for the Pribilofs. Up to the Arctic coast on the eastern and central coast, looking at east-northeast winds at 15 tomorrow. Brisk wind advisories here for the western Arctic coast, east and northeast at 25 knots, and east winds 20 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And for Monday, central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, brisk wind advisories continue. East winds at 25 knots with 30-knot easterlies on the western coast, and east to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea.